The year is 1971. It is a Tuesday morning in October and the air in Harlan County, Iowa, smells like cold mud and burning stubble. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. There's frost on the fence wire. And there, in the parking lot of the First Consolidated Bank of Boone County, standing perfectly still in his canvas barn coat, the collar brown with decades of honest grease, is a man named Elmer Good. He is 61 years old. His boots are risoled. His hat is the same Stetson he wore at his wedding in 1938, and in his right hand he is holding a cashier's check for $2.4 million. He does not smile, he does not rush. He pushes open the door of the bank, the same bank that 12 years prior tried to take his land, and he asks with extraordinary patience to speak with whoever owns the place. The teller looks at his cracked hands, she looks at his boots, she almost asks him to leave. She doesn't, something in his eyes stops her. And that is the beginning, but to understand that morning, to truly understand what that check meant, we have to go back, way back. Back to a rusted, beat-up, 12-year-old McCormick Farmall M that nobody in 3 counties would give $20 for. Let me tell you about Boone County, Iowa in 1951. It sits in the dead center of the state, threaded through by the Des Moines River, and in October the fields go amber from one horizon to the other like someone spilled fire across the earth. The county seat is the town of Boone, population 12,000, give or take a few hogs. It has a hardware store, 2 grain elevators, a diner called Mabel's that serves pie from 7 in the morning until they run out, and a bank. The First Consolidated Bank of Boone County. Owned since 1946 by a man named Harold Pritt. In 1951, the post-war optimism that had rolled through American agriculture was beginning to crest. The federal government was pushing modernization, bigger machines, bigger acreages, bigger debt. The John Deere dealership on First Avenue had a brand new Model 60 sitting in the window like a trophy. Olive green and gold, clean as a whistle, with a price tag of $2,100. That was real money then. That was a year's income for most families in that county. The county extension office was pushing something called economy of scale. Get big or get out, the pamphlet said. It smelled like progress. But the land itself didn't care about pamphlets. The dark, loamy soil of Boone County, what the old-timers called the black gold, not to be confused with oil, had been farmed the same way for 3 generations. Corn and soybeans, rotation, rest. And the farmers who listened to the land rather than the bank were doing all right. The ones who listened to the bank, that's a different story. Elmer Good was born in 1910, the 3rd son of a Bohemian immigrant family who had broken ground on 160 acres of Boone County farmland in 1887. His grandfather's name was originally Good, but the immigration officer at Ellis Island spelled it the way it sounded, and nobody ever bothered to change it back. Elmer was not a tall man, 5'8" in his work boots, but he was built like a loading dock, wide across the shoulders, with hands so large that he could palm a cantaloupe the way most men hold a baseball. He had a face that had been weathered to something resembling old saddle leather, and gray eyes that were slow to blink and quick to notice things other people missed. He had gone to the University of Iowa for 1 semester in 1928 before the money ran dry. But in that 1 semester, he had taken an agricultural mechanics course taught by a professor named Dale Lundgren, and something had clicked inside Elmer Good that never clicked off again. He came home to the farm and he read everything he could get his hands on: implement manuals, soil science journals, old USDA bulletins that most farmers used to start their stoves. He kept a notebook, a composition book with a black and white speckled cover that he filled with observations about soil compaction, diesel timing, and the behavior of iron under sustained heat. He wasn't book smart in the showy way, he was book smart in the quiet, dangerous way, the kind that doesn't announce itself. In 1937, Elmer married a woman named Bet Radke from a farm near Stratford. She was his match in every way, steady, unsentimental, with a laugh like a screen door in a windstorm. They had 2 boys, Raymond and Dale, and together the 4 of them worked 200 acres of some of the finest corn ground in the county. They had almost nothing on paper, and they had everything that mattered. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the people most dismissive of someone's worth are almost always the people who have never had to earn anything the hard way? Hold on to that, because here comes Harold Pritt. Harold Pritt did not grow up poor. His father had owned the First Consolidated Bank of Boone County since 1921, and Harold had inherited it in 1946 after returning from the war as a supply officer, a role that had kept him in London while men like Elmer Good's neighbors were in the Pacific. He wore his service well, regardless of what it had actually looked like. Harold was a big man, 6'2", fleshy in the jaw, with pale blue eyes and the kind of permanent tan you get from playing golf 3 times a week rather than working outdoors. He wore short-sleeved dress shirts in summer and a camel hair coat in fall. He drove a 1950 Buick Roadmaster, cream-colored, that he kept cleaner than most people kept their kitchens. He was not stupid. Stupid men don't run banks for 25 years. But Harold Pritt suffered from a very specific kind of arrogance. The arrogance of a man who has confused the map for the territory, who has looked at balance sheets so long that he has confused net worth with human worth. In his mind, the farmers of Boone County were divided into 2 categories. The forward-thinking ones, the ones who took his loans, bought new equipment, expanded their acreage, and the old-fashioned ones who were, in his personal taxonomy, fools who'd be gone in a generation anyway. Elmer Good, with his paid-off land and his 10-year-old tractor and his soil notebooks, was firmly in the second category. Harold had said as much more than once at the Saturday morning coffee table at Mabel's Diner, where the county's businessmen gathered to eat pie and feel important. He had a phrase he used for farmers like Elmer. Subsistence men, he called them, holdovers. He said it with a smile. He almost always smiled. The autumn of 1951 was when it came to a head. The occasion was the Boone County Farm Bureau's annual harvest supper, held the second Saturday of October at the 4-H fairgrounds on the edge of town. Long tables, folding chairs, boiled corn, fried chicken, 3 kinds of pie. The room smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something fried in lard. Elmer was there with Bet. Raymond, who was 14, had come along to help set up tables. The Goods sat near the middle of the room, not up front where the businessmen sat, not in the back with the young families still figuring things out. The middle, where they always were. The trouble started when Harold Pritt arrived with Clarence Biggs, who owned the John Deere dealership on First Avenue, and a third man, a state agricultural extension agent named Warren Halst from Ames. They had come ostensibly to talk about a federal modernization program. In practice, they had come to sell debt. Warren Halst gave a presentation, slides, a projector that smelled of hot metal when it warmed up, the new John Deere 60 tractor, the new Farmall Super M, the future of American agriculture. He talked about yield per acre gains. He talked about timeliness, getting the crop in faster, getting it out faster. He talked about the neighbor counties where farmers were already upgrading. The implication was plain: if you weren't upgrading, you were falling behind. Afterward, over coffee, Harold Pritt made his rounds. He shook hands, he laughed easily. He wrote figures on napkins. He stopped at Elmer Good's table. "Elmer," he said, pulling up a chair without being invited, "you give any thought to that loan we discussed?" "I didn't discuss any loan with you, Harold," Elmer said, with the patience of a man who has learned that most confrontations are best handled slowly. "Well, I've been thinking on your behalf then." Harold smiled at the men nearby, drawing them in. Clarence Biggs had drifted over. 2 other farmers stood with their coffee cups. "You're still running that old M, what, from 39? 41, Elmer said. "Lord," Harold shook his head theatrical. He looked around at the gathering audience. "Elmer Good is still running a 1941 Farmall M, gentlemen, the same machine he planted corn with when Hitler was still on the radio." Light laughter from the group, uncomfortable mostly, but laughter. Elmer said nothing. "Now I'm not here to embarrass you," Harold continued, leaning back, crossing his arms with the ease of a man who believed he was being generous. "But there's a new Super M sitting on Clarence's lot right now. 44 horsepower, live hydraulics, you could have it Monday. Terms are reasonable." "Terms are always reasonable," Elmer said, "until they aren't." More laughter, but different now. A few of the older farmers nodded. Harold's smile thinned just slightly. He didn't like being answered that way in public by a subsistence man. "Elmer, with respect, you're farming 200 acres with a machine that belongs in a museum. Your neighbor Earl Tasker put in a new Super M last spring, and he pulled 1,800 bushels more corn than you this season." That part was true, and everyone at the table knew it. "Earl Tasker also owes your bank $11,000, Elmer said quietly. Dead silence. Harold's face went through several colors quickly. "What I'm saying, Elmer continued, folding his hands on the table, is that a man can grow a lot of corn and have nothing to show for it. Or he can grow a little less corn and sleep without a weight on his chest. Harold stood up. Your choice, of course, he said. The warmth was gone from his voice entirely. But don't come to me in 5 years when your boys have left the farm and you're wondering where you went wrong. He walked away. Clarence Biggs followed him. Bet Good put her hand over Elmer's on the table, and he let out a long breath through his nose, and that was that. For now, let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you really looked at something everyone else had written off and saw not what it was, but what it could be? Because what nobody in that room understood, what Harold Pritt and Clarence Biggs and Warren Halst from Ames could not have known, because they had never spent 1,000 hours with their hands inside a machine, was what Elmer Good had been doing with that rusted 1941 Farmall M for the better part of 10 years. The McCormick Farmall M was introduced in 1939. It was, by the early 1950s, the most common row crop tractor in America. More than 300,000 had been built. It was a sturdy, honest machine, a 4-cylinder gasoline engine around 36 horsepower, a wide front axle option that made it work in a variety of field configurations. But like any machine of that era, it had known weaknesses. The carburetor was temperamental in cold weather. The magneto timing could drift under sustained heat load. The hydraulic system, a later addition, leaked predictably at the rear rockshaft seal, and the pistons, especially in hard-worked examples, would eventually lose compression, costing the operator anywhere from 10 to 20% of the engine's rated power. Most farmers lived with these problems. Some traded up, some called the dealer. Elmer had done something else entirely. He had fixed them, all of them, and then he had gone further. In the back of that composition notebook, filled with observations accumulated over a decade, were 11 pages of handwritten modifications. Not theories, not guesses. Tested procedures developed through careful, methodical experimentation over 12 full growing seasons. He had rejetted the carburetor with a needle valve configuration borrowed from an idea he'd read in a 1946 implement engineering paper, improving cold start performance down to 15 degrees below zero. He had built a custom heat shield for the magneto from sheet metal salvaged from a 1935 International truck hood, protecting it from the engine block's radiant heat during long-running hours. He had remachined the rear hydraulic seal seat on his own lathe, a South Bend 9-inch unit in the corner of his machine shed, and fitted it with a modern Boonean elastomer seal that didn't exist when the M was built, creating a hydraulic system that no longer leaked. And then, and this is the part that made the difference in the field, Elmer had rebuilt the engine. Not a standard rebuild, a careful one. He had bored the cylinders to the first oversize .020 over and fitted them with new rings, but then he had done something unusual. He had blueprinted the engine. He had measured every tolerance. He had matched the weights of the connecting rods within half a gram of each other on a postal scale. He had polished the combustion chambers to a consistent shape, and carefully set the compression ratio using a burette and a degree wheel in a procedure he had read about in a 1948 issue of Agricultural Engineering magazine. The result was a 1941 Farmall M that, when Elmer's son Raymond put a drawbar load on it in the fall of 1951, developed, by Elmer's careful measurement using a load cell he had fabricated himself, 43 horsepower at the belt, versus the factory-rated 36. He had taken a 12-year-old tractor that everyone assumed was on its last legs and transformed it, through pure mechanical intelligence and patient, methodical work, into a machine that outperformed a brand-new model. And he hadn't told a soul. Because Elmer Good had not been raised to boast, he had been raised to work. Now let me tell you about his field. He had been building his soil. For 9 years, he had been returning organic matter to the ground, winter cover crops, rotational timing that let the earth breathe, precise application of lime based on pH tests he ran himself using a kit from the State University Extension. His soil in 1951 had a tilth, a structure, a moisture-holding capacity, a biological activity that was measurably superior to the fields around him. His corn yields had not been lower than Earl Tasker's because his tractor was old. They had been lower because Elmer chose to plant at a population density that matched his soil's nitrogen capacity rather than push for a yield number he couldn't sustain without purchased inputs. He was not behind, he was playing a different game. And in the fall of 1955, the game was about to change tables. Let me tell you about the drought of 1955. It began in June with 2 weeks of no rain, and it didn't really end until September. Boone County baked. The Des Moines River dropped to a trickle you could step across in places. The corn in poorly drained fields curled from the bottom up, the leaves rolling into tubes to conserve moisture. By August, the county extension office was predicting the worst yield loss since the 1930s. It is in moments like this, when the weather removes every comfortable assumption, that the quality of a farmer's decisions in good years becomes visible. Elmer Good's corn stood straight. It shouldn't have by any ordinary measure. His acreage was no different from his neighbors. He had the same July heat, the same August dryness. But the soil he had been building for 9 years held moisture the way a sponge holds water. The organic matter, the billions of microorganisms in the top 8 inches of ground, created a structure that retained capillary water long after the neighboring fields had given up and gone hard. The Tasker's field across the section road went to 25 bushels per acre that year, average for a terrible drought. Elmer Good's field went to 78. Now let me be clear about what 78 bushels per acre in a drought year means. It means that when the elevator on the west side of Boone opened its scale house on the 1st of September, Elmer drove his 1941 Farmall M, pulling a 2-wagon train, Raymond on the tractor behind him with the old Ford 8N, to deliver corn when most of his neighbors had essentially nothing to sell. He had not borrowed money for new equipment, he had not expanded his debt, he had not listened to Harold Pritt. And he had corns. The elevator operator that day, a man named Art Schultz who had worked the scale house for 22 years, told the story for the rest of his life. He said that when the good wagons came in off the road, he thought for a moment they were coming from the wrong direction. The scale said what it said, and Art Schultz had it verified twice because he didn't want to write the number down and have it be wrong. 7,930 bushels of corn in a drought year. The price that September, because drought had crushed supply across the Midwest, was $2.15 per bushel. Elmer Good grossed $17,049.5 from his 1955 corn crop. His input costs, no loan payments, no new equipment depreciation, no purchased fertilizer, were $890 for the season. Fuel, seed, and a new set of tires for the M. Let me say that again. He netted over $16,000 in a year when the average Boone County farmer reported a loss. But that's not the moment came 3 weeks later. Because the drought had not only killed yields, it had killed cash flow, and cash flow is the oxygen of a farm operation. Without it, you cannot make your loan payments, and if you cannot make your loan payments, you go to see Harold Pritt. A man named Gus Fenchel had 340 acres of prime ground a mile west of Elmer's place. Gus was a good farmer, honest, hardworking, but he had followed the modernization path. In 1952, he had bought a new Farmall Super M on credit. In 1953, he had added a 2-row picker. In 1954, he had refinanced to expand 80 acres. His operation was leveraged the way the county extension office had told him to be leveraged. The drought of 1955 broke him. His yield was 22 bushels per acre. His loan payments to First Consolidated Bank of Boone County totaled $4,800 for the year. He could not make them. In November of 1955, Harold Pritt began foreclosure proceedings on the Fenchel farm. Elmer heard about it on a Thursday afternoon in November at Art Schultz's elevator. He went home. He sat at the kitchen table with Bet. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "How much cash have we got set aside?" Bet went to the cabinet where they kept the ledger book. She came back and read him the number. "That's enough," Elmer said. "For what?" Bet asked. "To help Gus." He drove to the Fenchel farm the next morning. He sat at Gus Fenchel's kitchen table. Gus, 54 years old, a man whose father had broken that land by hand, who had farmed it for 30 years, and he made him an offer. He would loan Gus $4,800, interest-free, term of 5 years on a handshake. Gus Fenchel looked at him for a long time. "Why?" he said. Elmer said, "Because your land is worth more than a bank's bad timing." The loan was repaid, every cent on schedule. But the story doesn't end there. The real moment came 15 years later, and it started with a phone call. Let me tell you what happens to a county when farmers fail. It happens quietly, the way water cuts stone, not in one dramatic event but in the gradual accumulation of small surrenders. A farm sold here. A family moved away there. The diner loses a few customers every year. The grain elevator processes fewer bushels. The school loses enrollment. And the bank, Harold Pritt's bank, grows larger on the collateral of the foreclosures. And Harold Pritt does not particularly notice what the county is losing, because he is focused on what the bank is gaining. By 1965, First Consolidated Bank of Boone County had foreclosed on 11 farms in the region. Some had been sold to neighbors at auction. Some had been consolidated into the holdings of a Des Moines investment group that Harold Pritt had connections to. The Pritt family, by most accounts, was doing extremely well. Elmer Good, by that same year, was also doing extremely well, in a way that was entirely invisible to anyone looking only at his equipment. He had not bought a new tractor. He was still running the M, now rebuilt for the second time, and he had added a 1948 Farmall H he had purchased for $180 from an estate sale, rebuilt, and pressed into service for lighter work. What Elmer had bought quietly was land. 4 times in 15 years, when neighboring farms had come to auction or when families had needed to sell quietly before a bank could force the issue, Elmer Good had been there. Not as a speculator, as a neighbor, he paid fair prices. He let 2 of the families stay on as tenants on favorable lease terms. He kept the land in corn and beans and cover crops, building the soil the way his grandfather had believed soil ought to be built. By 1968, Elmer Good farmed 780 acres of Boone County's best ground. He owned every acre outright. Harold Pritt found out about this in pieces over time from conversations at the coffee table at Mabel's diner. And the silence that settled over Harold Pritt in those moments, the slight pause before he changed the subject, the way his jaw moved without words, was something the old-timers at the coffee table noticed and enjoyed and mostly had the grace not to comment on. The county didn't laugh at Elmer Good's rusted Farmall anymore. They hadn't for a long time. Section 9, The Aftermath, 22-00-2700. In the spring of 1970, Harold Pritt had a health scare. He was 62 years old, and his doctor, a man who had known him since childhood, told him in plain terms that his blood pressure was dangerous and his lifestyle was the reason. He needed to slow down. He needed to consider what the next chapter looked like. What it looked like, Harold decided after 6 months of deliberation, was a sale. He wanted to sell First Consolidated Bank of Boone County. Not to a regional chain, Harold still had enough local pride for that, but to an individual buyer, someone who would keep the name, keep the local character, keep the loan officers who had worked for him for 20 years. He put the asking price at $2.3 million for the physical assets and the loan portfolio. It was a fair number. The bank's appraiser from Des Moines agreed. The problem Harold did not anticipate was the quality of his buyer pool. 2 regional bank executives expressed interest and then withdrew when they looked more carefully at the portfolio. The loan book had problems. A pattern of aggressive lending in the 1950s and 60s had left a residue of restructured debts and undercollateralized positions that looked worse the longer you looked at them. The kind of thing that only becomes visible in a prolonged examination of the records. By the fall of 1970, Harold was down to one serious inquiry. His broker called him on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Harold, I have a buyer who has completed his review of the books and is prepared to offer $2.4 million, cash, closing within 60 days. Harold said, "Who is it?" The broker said the name. The story goes, and this story was told at Mabel's diner for 30 years after, so take the dialogue with appropriate salt, that Harold Pritt was quiet on the phone for so long that his broker asked if the connection had been lost. Then Harold said, "Elmer Good doesn't have $2.4 million. The broker said his attorney's trust account does. Elmer had been saving and investing for 20 years. The land he'd accumulated, leveraged carefully and only once, through a Ames agricultural credit institution rather than Harold Pritt's bank, had allowed him to compound his position steadily. He had also, in 1963, partnered quietly with 2 other Boone County farmers, including Gus Fenchel, whose debt he had once covered on a handshake, in a grain merchandising operation that had been modestly but consistently profitable for 7 years. The $2.4 million cashier's check that Elmer Good carried through the door of First Consolidated Bank of Boone County on that October Tuesday in 1971 was real. It was certified. And it was the culmination of 20 years of patient, quiet, methodical work by a man whom Harold Pritt had once called a holdover in front of a room full of his neighbors. The closing happened in Harold Pritt's own office. Elmer sat across the desk from him in the same canvas barn coat, the same Stetson. He signed the papers with a Parker pen his son Raymond had given him for Christmas in 1963. The notary was a young woman named Karen Vogt who had gone to school with Raymond and who kept her expression carefully neutral throughout the proceedings. Harold Pritt shook Elmer's hand. Elmer shook it. That was all. After the closing, Elmer drove back to the farm. He didn't stop at Mabel's. He didn't call the newspaper. He didn't tell the story himself. That story traveled, as stories do in small counties, on its own momentum, arriving at the coffee table at Mabel's without any assistance from Elmer Good. His first action as the new owner of First Consolidated Bank of Boone County was to instruct the bank's loan officers to review the outstanding agricultural loan portfolio and identify any farmer who was technically in arrears, but who had a viable operation and a reasonable path to repayment. There were 4 such farmers. Elmer restructured all 4 loans personally. He did not forgive the debt. He was not sentimental about numbers, but he restructured the terms in ways the previous ownership had refused to consider. 3 of those 4 farmers successfully repaid their loans and kept their land. The 4th, a 70-year-old widower named Carl Hennessy, could not. Elmer bought the land from him directly at full market value and let Carl live in the farmhouse until he died, which was 7 years later in 1978. Gus Fenchel served on the bank's advisory board from 1972 until his retirement in 1980. Raymond Good took over management of the farm operation in 1975 and expanded it to 1,200 acres by 1985, still running row crop corn and soybeans in rotation, still building soil the way his father had taught him. The 1941 Farmall M, rebuilt twice, was retired to the back of the machine shed in 1974. Elmer never sold it. He never quite had the heart to. When Elmer died in 1988 at the age of 78, his obituary in the Boone County Register was 3 paragraphs long. It listed his survivors. It mentioned his farm. It did not mention the bank because the family had sold it in 1981 to a regional institution, and Elmer had not considered it a particularly interesting detail. The obituary did not mention the 1941 Farmall M. Some things don't need to be written down to be remembered. In the spring of 1970, Harold Pritt had a health scare. He was 62 years old, and his doctor, a man who had known him since childhood, told him in plain terms that his blood pressure was dangerous and his lifestyle was the reason. He needed to slow down. He needed to consider what the next chapter looked like. What it looked like, Harold decided after 6 months of deliberation, was a sale. He wanted to sell First Consolidated Bank of Boone County. Not to a regional chain, Harold still had enough local pride for that, but to an individual buyer, someone who would keep the name, keep the local character, keep the loan officers who had worked for him for 20 years. He put the asking price at $2.3 million for the physical assets and the loan portfolio. It was a fair number. The bank's appraiser from Des Moines agreed. The problem Harold did not anticipate was the quality of his buyer pool. 2 regional bank executives expressed interest and then withdrew when they looked more carefully at the portfolio. The loan book had problems. A pattern of aggressive lending in the 1950s and 60s had left a residue of restructured debts and undercollateralized positions that looked worse the longer you looked at them. The kind of thing that only becomes visible in a prolonged examination of the records. By the fall of 1970, Harold was down to one serious inquiry. His broker called him on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Harold, I have a buyer who has completed his review of the books and is prepared to offer $2.4 million, cash, closing within 60 days. Harold said, "Who is it?" The broker said the name. The story goes, and this story was told at Mabel's Diner for 30 years after, so take the dialogue with appropriate salt, that Harold Pritt was quiet on the phone for so long that his broker asked if the connection had been lost. Then Harold said, "Elmer Good doesn't have $2.4 million. The broker said his attorney's trust account does." Elmer had been saving and investing for 20 years. The land he'd accumulated, leveraged carefully and only once through a Ames agricultural credit institution rather than Harold Pritt's bank, had allowed him to compound his position steadily. He had also, in 1963, partnered quietly with two other Boone County farmers, including Gus Fenchel, whose debt he had once covered on a handshake, in a grain merchandising operation that had been modestly but consistently profitable for 7 years. The $2.4 million cashier's check that Elmer Good carried through the door of First Consolidated Bank of Boone County on that October Tuesday in 1971 was real. It was certified. And it was the culmination of 20 years of patient, quiet, methodical work by a man whom Harold Pritt had once called a holdover in front of a room full of his neighbors. The closing happened in Harold Pritt's own office. Elmer sat across the desk from him in the same canvas barn coat, the same Stetson. He signed the papers with a Parker pen his son Raymond had given him for Christmas in 1963. The notary was a young woman named Karen Vogt who had gone to school with Raymond and who kept her expression carefully neutral throughout the proceedings. Harold Pritt shook Elmer's hand. Elmer shook it. That was all. After the closing, Elmer drove back to the farm. He didn't stop at Mabel's. He didn't call the newspaper. He didn't tell the story himself. That story traveled, as stories do in small counties, on its own momentum, arriving at the coffee table at Mabel's without any assistance from Elmer Good. His first action as the new owner of First Consolidated Bank of Boone County was to instruct the bank's loan officers to review the outstanding agricultural loan portfolio and identify any farmer who was technically in arrears, but who had a viable operation and a reasonable path to repayment. There were 4 such farmers. Elmer restructured all 4 loans personally. He did not forgive the debt. He was not sentimental about numbers, but he restructured the terms in ways the previous ownership had refused to consider. 3 of those 4 farmers successfully repaid their loans and kept their land. The 4th, a 70-year-old widower named Carl Hennessy, could not. Elmer bought the land from him directly at full market value and let Carl live in the farmhouse until he died, which was 7 years later in 1978. Gus Fenchel served on the bank's advisory board from 1972 until his retirement in 1980. Raymond Good took over management of the farm operation in 1975 and expanded it to 1,200 acres by 1985, still running row crop corn and soybeans in rotation, still building soil the way his father had taught him. The 1941 Farmall M, rebuilt twice, was retired to the back of the machine shed in 1974. Elmer never sold it. He never quite had the heart to. When Elmer died in 1988 at the age of 78, his obituary in the Boone County Register was 3 paragraphs long. It listed his survivors. It mentioned his farm. It did not mention the bank because the family had sold it in 1981 to a regional institution and Elmer had not considered it a particularly interesting detail. The obituary did not mention the 1941 Farmall M. Let me pause here at the end of this story and ask you something. What did Elmer Good have that Harold Pritt didn't? It wasn't money, not at first. It wasn't education. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't connections, and it certainly wasn't a new tractor. What Elmer Good had was a quality that is genuinely rare, genuinely difficult, and genuinely undervalued in every age, including ours. He had patience married to knowledge. Not patience alone. Patience alone is just passivity wearing a better coat. And not knowledge alone. Knowledge without patience is just a man who knows things, anxious and unsatisfied. But the two together, combined in a man who was also honest and who kept his word and who understood that his land was not a short-term investment but a long-term relationship. That combination does not make noise, it does not flash, it does not sit in the showroom window on First Avenue. It sits in a machine shed, working after dark, with a composition notebook and a South Bend lathe, and a mind that refuses to stop asking how something could be better. We live in a world that is dazzled by newness. The new model, the new method, the new metric. We have been told in 1,000 different languages that what we already have is insufficient, that progress requires acquisition, that the old way is always the lesser way. And sometimes that's true. New tools are real, progress is real. But the story of Elmer Good reminds us of something that gets lost in the noise. The man who understands his existing tool completely, who has studied it, improved it, and applied it with patience and precision will often outperform the man who simply bought the newest version. Because the tool is not the strategy. Knowledge is the strategy. Patience is the strategy. Soil built over 9 careful years, quietly waiting for a drought year to reveal its advantage, that is the strategy. Harold Pritt looked at Elmer Good's rusted Farmall M and saw a museum piece. Elmer Good looked at it and saw 43 horsepower, rebuilt to tolerance, sitting in front of 780 acres of the best-tended soil in Boone County. They were both looking at the same object. Only one of them was seeing it correctly. The next time someone laughs at the old way, the old machine, the old farmer who hasn't upgraded before you join in, before you nod along, remember a Tuesday morning in October of 1971. Remember a man in a canvas barn coat and a worn Stetson, walking through the door of a bank with a cashier's check for $2.4 million. Remember that he didn't rush, he didn't hurry. He had been heading toward that door for 20 years, one quiet step at a time. And nobody saw him coming. If this story moved you, if you know someone who farms the old way, thinks the long way, works without applause, share this with them. They deserve to hear it. And if you're new here, welcome to The Forgotten Farmer. Every story on this channel is for the people the history books pass over. Subscribe and we'll tell you their stories. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. The McCormick Farmall M tractor was produced from 1939 to 1952. The agronomic practices described reflect documented techniques of mid-20th century American farming. Boone County, Iowa is a real place. The farmers in this story are fictional composites.